Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Welcome. I'm Erin Axelrod, a partner at Lift Economy. And today, oh my goodness, listeners are so in for a treat. I have been anticipating this podcast for many months now, and I'm not going to read a bio about our presenters. I would just love for our listeners to welcome Dominic and Blaine. They're worker owners at Earthbound Builders. And as you get settled, get comfortable, just sit back, listen to the words, and feel into the trust that what we are bringing to you today here on the Next Economy Now is just what you need to hear. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Dominic and Blaine. And Dominic, I'm going to pass it over to you first to share a little bit of how you got into this work that you do as a natural builder and a little bit about Earthbound Builders.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having us. Yeah, so I'm Dom. I'm a worker owner with Earthbound, as you mentioned. My journey into this work was a little unconventional. I was actually studying public health and got really interested in nutrition and how food deserts were happening in community. And through some of the research I was doing, I started urban farming and urban gardening. That was around 2012. And I was having all these great experiences with community doing urban gardening and farming, and was starting to become more disillusioned with school. Why are we doing all this research when a lot of the answers are very apparent? And I felt at the time I just want to get my hands in the soil and just start helping boots on the ground. So I ended up leaving school, become an urban farmer full time. And so flash forward a couple of years, I was in DC at this point working in Southeast DC. So for folks that know DC at all, it's one of the lowest income areas of the city, and one of the areas with the most amount of food deserts. And while working down there, there was a workshop that was put on by a group called the Black Dirt Farm Collective, which I'm sure Blaine will talk to you more about in just a second. And Blaine was actually one of the instructors at the workshop, and him and I met and hit it off. And he was talking to me about the need that there was through a lot of his organizing work and the work that Black Dirt Farm Collective was doing for there to be infrastructure for farmers. There's, not just urban farmers, but especially our farmers in rural spaces that are doing small scale organic and sustainable farming. There's this real need for sustainable and durable infrastructure. And a couple of years back, Blaine had started Earthbound, just building greenhouses and high tunnels and things like that, outbuildings for farmers. And so in 2016, I sort of joined forces with him. And the rest has kind of been history. It was this process of going onto all these land bases, seeing some of the infrastructure needs that farmers had initially, and then it kind of expanded out to rural landowners in general, where we started to take this, approach and gain this mindset of how can we not just provide really great infrastructure for these farmers and build out our co-op. At this point, we're already formalized as a co-op and sort of working collectively. But how can we make the materials and the processes and the practices that we're doing as sustainable and localized as possible? And so that's when Earthbound started to take the real shift, and myself started to take the real shift towards there's a whole new way of thinking around constructing the buildings we live in and the places that we stay that involves a lot more sustainable practices. And so that's really quickly the sort of journey that took me from being a wide-eyed college student to now being a worker owner and a carpenter for a construction co-op.
I love it, Dom. And I can see now why the story is really kind of defying the kind of quintessential biographies or, we're going to get into it. So Blaine, how about you? How did you get into this work as a founder of Earthbound?
Yeah, thanks for having us, Erin. And I want to apologize to the listeners. I was just sanding Eastern White Pine without a respirator. I've got the sniffles as a result. So if you hear me sniffling, it's simply just because there's pine dust in my nostrils. That's just what it is. Yeah, so how did I come to this point or to this work? So I grew up in the Boy Scouts, and I knew very early on in my life that I was not going to be destined to work inside of buildings. That I was going to be outside working with my hands. I could sense that very early on. And through some trials and tribulations, that was confirmed for me through internships where they had in accounting and business management and stuff during college and high school and things like that. So I've always worked with my hands, and I moved around a lot as I was growing up, and I'm still growing up and I'm still moving around coincidentally. But I grew up in Davis, California for the first about 11 years of my life, which is an agricultural town, especially at that time it was. Now it's quite become more than that. So all of my friends' parents, they worked for the university in some manner or another around agriculture or food production. So I had an exposure to sort of the agrarian dynamic, if you will, from an early age. And so during high school, when I started to work, I would just work on a friend's farm, and I didn't think anything of it. And then as I was in college and I was moving around and I moved in with family, my sister in Georgia, that side of my family was all in construction. And so construction executives. And so I went from working on farms between school break to reffing in soccer games and cleaning up construction sites, which was a miserable experience. But you got to start somewhere. And so then when I was in college, I needed an internship to satisfy my business degree. And so I decided to intern at the original farm that I worked at in high school. And that farmer really blew my mind open because he really just showed me that to be in ag, you have to be an astrophysicist, a scientist, a carpenter, a business manager, sort of a Renaissance person. And I really struck to that. And so in any case, I just started farming full on from the age of 18 going on 19 through college. And then after college, and I would always do the carpentry stuff on the farm that I worked for at the time because I was an itinerant farmer. And so over those years, I had the opportunity to travel to about 15 countries because of agriculture. And one of the many observations that I learned on all those travels was that sustainable agriculture or agroecology and natural building, they come from the same root. They are like intimately tied together. That in fact, to have a sustainable agricultural system, the infrastructure has to reflect the values of that said sustainable system. And so that lends itself to natural building or low impact construction methodologies. And so that was one of my early aha moments, oh, okay, these things are interconnected in a really profound and sort of historic way. And so I kind of got burnt out on farming when I was in my mid-20s. A buddy of mine was running a construction company, and I was working for him during my off season, so winters and sort of early springs. And so he ended up moving out of town, and it left this void, if you will, in the sort of the agricultural sector in our region in the Mid-Atlantic for a company that specialized in ag infrastructure. And so I saw that opening. I started Earthbound Building, Forestry and Farm. And, in our early days, we did a lot of forestry work, actually, because I love being in the forest. I live in the forest. I've lived in the forest. And so we did selective harvesting, low impact forestry, community forestry. So things like what's called worst first. So anytime there was a storm or trees that looked like would be taken down by a storm, we would take those trees down and then repurpose them, making trails and making trail vestibules, benches, you kind of name it. And that was our jam for a little bit. And it's just kind of evolved over the years. Once we became almost purely construction, we were doing high tunnels for the longest. And that's just simply what farmers wanted at the time. As time went on, we started to get asked to do different things. And so we started doing, deer fences and then tree houses and then random, you name it, farm buildings. And then I had the opportunity to head to Vermont to learn how to timber frame. And then that was sort of the end and the start of history, if you will, for us. We then kind of went full steam ahead into just trying to timber frame as much as possible, and it's been a slow transition. And so I did want to just sort of distinguish a few things here that sort of, I think, gives the broader context. And so, like I mentioned while I was traveling, I had this realization that sustainable agriculture and natural building, low impact construction methods, they're from the same seed, they're from the same fiber, if you will. Another thing that was also very apparent to me at the time was that sustainable agriculture and low impact building, as seen around the world, is actually a very collective, communal, and cooperative endeavor. It's actually, the experience here in the States is actually very atypical to what you might experience around the world. And that got my motors turning. I became obsessed with doing things cooperatively and collectively. And that part of that is just how I grew up, but then this politicization that I was going through in my 20s. And so when I started Earthbound, I started it as a co-op of one, and we ebbed and flowed over the years. And now to where we are with, officially having worker owners beyond just myself. So we've got sustainable agriculture and natural building are tied to each other. Collective and cooperative sort of social dynamics and power dynamics are also tied together. And so then, the broad framework, if you think about natural building, this is going to be an oversimplification, but you can break natural building down to sort of into three broad categories in our view. You have building systems, in which timber framing is a building system within the context of natural building. Then you have enclosures and finishes. And this is what all people think about natural building. They think about cob, right? And straw. Those are actually enclosures. You can also they can be building systems, but predominantly from our perspective, we think about those as enclosure systems. And then, of course, the plaster, which being the finishes. And then the third category is what I would just loosely call sort of closed loop systems. And that's when you start to bring in things like gray water recycling, passive solar design, all the things that begin to close the loop on the production, consumption, waste cycle that our society has no closed loop methods at scale to really tout about. And so within that vein, we firmly see timber framing as a form of natural building. And then we have also dabbled in Strawbell, and we have some Strawbell houses coming up. And so for us, it's timber frame with a Strawbell wrap, or a hybrid of the two, where there might be a Strawbell infill system and a heavy timber roof system on top of it. So in any case, that's sort of the broad context that we might find ourselves in terms of the scope of our work. And then also going to the point that Dom mentioned, we really are firmly rooted in supporting small scale agriculture, rural landowners, and then of course community projects, because we want to be a part of the just transition to a better society, in addition to being the best craftspeople that we want to be, creating the most beautiful buildings possible. We want to hold all those at the same time, which are increasingly more challenging to do as the years go along. But those are central to sort of how we, those different demographics in terms of folks we work with are central to essentially everything that we do as a company.
Wow, both of you, so beautifully said, and so awesome to have you here. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom. You brought up just transition, and I'd love to hear from both of you around, what does that look like? What does that mean to you? And also, you've started to unpack what makes Earthbound Builders so unique, being that it is rooted in cooperativism. I'd love to hear more from your perspective. What is unique about the work that you're doing that is so additive to just transition?
Yeah, I can take a dive in, especially from the cooperative piece. There's an African saying that we've sort of tossed around a little bit, and it keeps coming up for me. But if you want to go faster, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. And that, I think, is really rooted at a lot of the ethos of where Earthbound Building as a cooperative came from, as Blaine had mentioned, some of the origins, and then sort of moving forward where we see ourselves positioning ourselves in a way to be able to provide impact for communities that we came from, and to be able to show that there are different ways to engage with your labor. I think now there's such a despair, I think, around like the relationship that especially laborers and bosses have, when in fact the industry that we're in has so much potential for lots of like small businesses and lots of growth to happen, and in ways that are using natural materials and ecological building practices. And so I think Earthbound and the model that we have, is really able to show that by providing folks a workspace where they're able to problem solve and to be able to, use creative thinking and importantly, also able to get a dignified wage. You start to see, people kind of, working, more at their like kind of optimal self. And you see communities becoming more inspired to like take on projects and do more of that sort of work. And that's like, really important pieces of the just transition are just like individual communities and individual folks in communities feeling empowered to like take back their own wages and reclaim their time. So I think that that's one thing that we've always sort of been working towards and thinking about is like just a total revitalization of what labor means and what your time really means and the work that you do really means. And then I think as Blaine really alluded to really well, natural building and the work that we're doing in timber framing and, all of that sort of, it's not just construction, but it kind of opens folks' consciousness a little bit around like their natural environment. The sort of conventional construction industry and the materials that are being used are like, so devoid from like any human heart. They've been through machines and kilns and, and chemicalized. And so there's a real different feel when you're actually like working with materials that you've seen come from the land or, have a really, really direct relationship to the place that you're in. It sort of changes your mindset and can change community's mindset around sort of projects, again, that could be taken on and how folks could actually work together. So, I think that from the cooperative work that we do and the natural building work we do, I think that they both feed in really strongly to a just transition. And again, coming out of that movement space, we've been oriented to that in a lot of ways and are really working towards that.
Welcome to your daughter, River. I know she's here with us too, and it's so sweet to hear her. Ultimately, she's who we're doing this for, right? The future generation. So welcome to her. Blaine, would you add to that too? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I can certainly add to that. And I call Dom our co-op guru because he's a humble person, but he consults groups all around the country transitioning to being a co-op. And so he's quite good at what he does in many regards, but definitely in that respect. And then I would be remiss to not also just sort of highlight another co-op member, two other co-op members of ours, Amber Sam, who's an awesome woodworker and timber framer. And we are just truly blessed to be able to be in a co-op with her. And then there's Randy Johnson, who's seasonal. He's actually a school teacher by trade, but a timber framer and carpenter by passion. And so that actually rounds out our full crew. And so I just want to give them a shout out because they deserve more than a shout out, but for the sake of the podcast, shout out. And so just want to put that out there. Yeah, and I guess to the point of like the economic transition or just transition, one of the big pieces that we ideologically wanted to organize ourselves around, there's many pieces, but one of the big pieces is dignified work. The idea, the notion, the cultural practices stem from one's dignity really cannot be undervalued, in our opinion. And that our society, our economy, capitalism, at its core, does not care about a worker's dignity. The only thing it cares about is maximizing profit. And when that's the only agenda, everything else is part and parcel to satisfying that. And so for us, of course, generating profit is a no-brainer. We're a small business, if not anything else. But beyond that, or in addition to that, the way in which we relate to each other, communicate to each other, the type of jobs that we take, the type of clients that we work with, the type of skills that we support, all that is rooted in the individual in our co-op feeling dignified and empowered, the best person that they can be. And so without dignity at the core, it can be hard to sort of wrangle this broader elusive goal that I just mentioned of sort of emancipating the productive capacity of the human. And so that's sort of at our micro scale, and taking that to the macro, there are different lessons that, we can offer up that have been offered to us in terms of how other businesses operate. Because like I mentioned before, the cooperative sector here in the U.S. is actually significantly under-organized compared to a number of places around the world. And I think that co-ops can be a really strong instrument in the just transition, in transitioning at a small scale microeconomies to being more human-centric to being more earth-centric. Simply because, as Dom said, if you want to go faster, go alone. But if you want to go further, you need to do it together. And so that's the only thing I just want to just highlight or drill down on, is that this really at the core of it for us at this like micro scale is how we relate to each other. Is our work dignified, not just in what we produce, but in how we produce it? That's a really key piece to the just transition from our standpoint. The broader like macro stuff, like the struggle against capital and oppression and violence, all that still holds constant. And that stuff is a little bit out of our locus of control. And so that's why I'm stressing on, this point around dignity in particular.
So well said. Yeah. And I love that you brought in the kind of global context around cooperativism, because certainly, in the US, I struggle a lot with I think there's 300 cooperatives in the US versus, across the globe a lot more. And why is that? And so I'm curious to move into this space a little bit more. And I'm so excited because a lot of our listeners probably don't have a good background of like, what is a high tunnel? Like didn't even think about the connections between sustainable agriculture and natural building. Curious about, can you talk about the ecological and economics around natural building and this sector? And like, why should just anybody who maybe hasn't ever touched a hammer or nail or been involved in building something that they occupy space-wise, why should they care?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that one. I don't know why someone should care much about anything, but I will say why we care and why we feel that that's important. But the broader context, when we're looking at this jewel of a rock hurtling through space at 300 million some odd miles an hour, orbiting around the sun, orbiting around other galaxies, it's sacred. And this place that we call Earth, call home, should be protected. It should be valued. And the unfortunate reality is that, broadly speaking, human activity in modern capitalist society is the antithesis of cherishing this sacred home. And so concretely within the context of the construction industry, and I should say like I'm in the construction industry, but I was also in the agriculture industry. And if you tie the two of them together, they are contributors for almost 2/3 of the planet's greenhouse gas emissions. They use almost, in some cases of water, for example, conventional agriculture and conventional construction use something like 70% of the world's freshwater resources. 1% of the planet Earth is freshwater. And these two industries alone are using the majority of that precious resource in a non-recyclable way. And that's just in the context of water. We know that in the US, for example, the built environment, the consumption of energy in our buildings is about 60% of all energy consumed across the country. And that's on an energy level. You tie that to waste, the numbers are still very much the same. And you can just sort of run that down the rabbit hole. And so the case is there, the research there, the numbers are there, the experience is there for us to see that the way we build buildings, the way we use buildings, and the way we don't use buildings are adversely affecting both the planet and human health. And this is a new and radical phenomenon. Prior to this conventional construction industry and conventional agriculture, and we're talking pre-late 1800s, it was just natural building. It wasn't even called natural building. It was just the way people built based upon the access to the local resources that they have. For example, that's why you have timber framing developed in Europe and in Japan and Southeast Asia, namely because that's the major resources that they had access to in addition to their cultural practices, versus places like in Mesoamerica, here in Turtle Island, or in the US, what we now call the US, and in Africa, the way that they built their homes was situated around nomadicy, large territorial organization. And so their homes and the way they built were reflective of those cultural practices and societal constructs. And so, we're using the word natural building, but what we're really actually talking about is sort of the revalorization of traditional building practices set within a modern context. And so, the big thing is like in conventional construction, you have very high material inputs, which are external, the costs are externalized. So you can get OSB for, outside of COVID for $20 or $30 a sheet. In COVID, it grew up to $90 in some cases. But that cost is externalized. They're not taking into the cost of the petroleum that's pumped to make that OSB even possible, the greenhouse gases emitted. So truthfully, we should be paying $300 a sheet for OSB, but those costs are externalized. So the conventional market is set up with high costs or median costs, but standardized material inputs and low labor costs, right? The idea is let's standardize everything so we can have low-skilled labor build low-quality buildings that only last the life cycle of a mortgage. Versus natural building flips that on its head in the context of this modern arena that we're in. Well, we have relatively inexpensive yet high-quality material inputs, whether that's timber, straw, hemp, sand, plaster, you sort of go down that rabbit hole, but the labor input skyrockets because the knowledge set and the expertise required to deliver some of these natural buildings is quite specialized. And so that's why you tend to see predominantly in the natural building arena, it's like, who is receiving these natural homes? Who is receiving these natural buildings? Who's building those natural homes? Who's building those natural buildings? It's a certain cultural and economic demographic majority of the time that's benefiting from it. And part of that is access to that information, access to that cultural demographic, and then, of course, access to the financial resources to pay for a home that's natural, quote unquote, but it might have cost $400 a square foot. And so inherent to the modern context of natural building, the contradiction that is limiting the broad expansion of natural building, which is what I just attempted to highlight. And so it's a very complicated and sort of nuanced debate, if you will, which is how to make natural building affordable. On one end, you have the homeowner builder, which like that right now is by and large the best way to make natural building affordable is that the homeowner is the GC on the process and is the primary driver of the labor force, in addition to contractors, subs, and volunteers, and family, of course, because you bring in community. And in addition to that, the natural building context has a whole slew of cultural and sort of social dynamics that come with the building process from a design and pre-construction standpoint in terms of integrated design to an actual like project delivery standpoint. It's very typical that you'll see a natural built structure that took, many hands to build it. One, because it keeps the cost down, but also two, that's just what it takes. It takes a lot of people to build a building, and that is no different in the context of natural building. And when you're using non-toxic, sort of low impact, low decibel required materials and processes, you can have conversations with people. You can build relationships and you can build community. And a lot of times that's where you tend to see natural building sort of at its highlight. And so, we're always, I think I get an email at least twice a week about someone wanting to build a natural cob home. And I want to use that as an example to sort of try to contextualize natural building today. The adage that people, I think, see in their mind when they think natural building, they're thinking about like, a hobbit hut, this home mashed together out of muddy feet and hands of clay, a mixture of clay, sand, chopped straw, and some water. And you build this like awesome hut and it's perfect. So that's sort of this romantic ideal. But then you have Strawbell Building, which the folks out of California have advanced this, sort of tenfold over the years. But Strawbell Building is actually relatively recent in the context of natural building materials, right? Because straw was not baled up until 100 years ago. So to use bales as a method of construction could have only happened once a baler was created and thus bales were made. But then you had Wattle and Daub, which predates most any of this, which basically is the organization of sticks or bamboo or reed grass or other types of grass woven together to create a structure. Then you basically plaster mud on either side of that. And that is still used in many parts around the world, particularly in the tropical and subtropical climates of the planet. And so predominantly today, though, I will say that we're in the hunt to what we call crack the code, which is to build a natural or non-toxic building that is affordable. And affordability is a context. It's not a static thing. It's contextual, and it's also it's a moving target. So what might be affordable in Vermont will be very different than what might be affordable in Maryland versus what might be, quote unquote, affordable in South Georgia. And natural building demands that the builder, the individual that is engaged in that process, take into context the local conditions from which that building is going to exist in. So that's both knowing where are you going to get your building materials from on over to how is this home getting designed. That kind of dictates this design process with some dialogue with the end user or the client. But in sort of the natural building design build integrative design process, we sort of flip that on the head and say, actually, this is a very iterative, didactic conversation between how you plan to use the space, where are you getting these materials from, how are you going to use these materials, how are you going to put things together? There's this back and forth in the design process that natural building demands versus a very straightforward method that we see in the conventional sort of the design side of the broader construction industry. And so I'm just going to stop there because I feel like I'm rambling. But, that sort of, I hope, paints this broad picture around a natural building and the conventional construction and why it's important and thought-provoking to engage in it.
Wow. For a moment there when you said crack the code, I thought you were going to go into all the problems with the building codes too and what's blocking that. But I just am so appreciative of your words of wisdom around affordability as a context. Wow. Blew my mind open there. Curious if you have anything to add before I ask another juicy question.
No, I mean, that was totally like a sum up of so many conversations that we've had as a co-op, trying to figure out this economies of scale thing with materials that don't have that, same quantity and supply chain as the conventional industry. Just, sort of makes the natural building world a little more expensive and challenging to navigate, but certainly something that we're invested in doing. And it's kind of at the core of what our work is. Okay, River. Shut up, yo.
River's got to interject there too. Yeah. Well said. And, you've spoken a little bit to this. I am curious kind of what are the other barriers that you're encountering in terms of mainstreaming this, in terms of, what keeps you up at night? Yeah. Just sharing a little bit more, I think, with listeners would be really helpful. What are some other barriers you're encountering?
Yeah, I can quickly go before I get interrupted again. I think that around the consciousness with natural building, I think that there's still, a little bit of like kind of popular education to be done. Folks, potential clients and things like that who haven't heard of natural building, when we start to talk about it or even use that phrase, I think as Blaine had mentioned, they're immediately thinking of like some sort of mud home and this like long drawn out process and asking, really good questions around like, well, it's here in Maryland, it rains for a good part of the year and it's humid for almost the entire year. Like, how is that going to work with, quote unquote, natural materials? And so there's this whole sort of educational, edification process that we have to go through and are working to, be a voice for the mainstream, kind of moving forward. Like, how can we get some of this information out there and get more and more folks, especially again, like landowners and farmers, get the word out that there's these practices that are out there that could potentially use materials from their land or from local that could really change what the whole practice could look like. So I think that it's growing, like things like Instagram and this sort of whole like kind of natural movement that a lot of our generation is on. I think it's leaning that way, as folks are like looking at more, off-grid living, if you will, and like kind of looking at tiny houses and yurts. I think sort of the natural progression of that is to like start to learn and be exposed to more natural building. And then as folks get serious about that process, I think there is a lot of education that's out there. It's just, again, about like conversations like this happening and us being able to let folks.
Yeah. And then it's sort of at the macro level, there's an elder, Dr. Owusu Bandeli, Baba Owusu. And he has this phrase that goes, "There is nothing new underneath the sun except for the history you do not know." And I just sort of offer that up because there are litany of experiences and examples here in the U.S. over the last 40 or 50 years. And then, of course, internationally, for 40, 50, 60 plus years, make a really strong case and basis for why the construction industry and our built environment has to go in a different direction. Just from the oil crisis of 68 or 70 something, 76 or so, we've seen the transformation of the construction industry take a slow escalation to where we are now, which is like this obsession with energy efficiency. And that's a good obsession to have, because the idea is that if we can transition our buildings and our built environment to a more efficiently run entity in terms of energy consumption, then that will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, is the basic idea. And so you have like Passive House Institute, and then you've got net zero, if you will, along those lines. And you've got LEED, which LEED is sort of, for lack of a better term, but Passive House and sort of net zero appears to be the future of the conventional construction industry. And that's a good future for the conventional construction industry to go into. But you still need folks like New Frameworks or Healthy Home Artisans or Earthbound Building or Year of Mud, these design build outfits that are stationed around the country that can push the envelope even further at a small scale. Because if the broader question is, how do we move the needle? How do we actually fundamentally transform the relations of power production and consumption in the construction industry? Can Passive House and net zero do that at the macro level at scale? Maybe, but without a in-depth power and social analysis and sort of will, what we're going to produce are going to be really energy efficient buildings for affluent people. And that's what we see today. But the opportunity for these smaller design build companies that are rooted in local and regional territories, the opportunity is much higher and the ceiling is much higher for groups like ourselves and those that I mentioned to not just only produce real world experiences and examples of proof of concepts, to build the social capital necessary to take it to scale in their local economy or local jurisdiction. And that's really what it's about, is how do you crack the code on affordable, natural, rural housing? How do you do that in an urban center? And that's going to require support from the local government, support from nonprofits, and then it's going to require just creative people being in the right position at the right time to make things happen. And none of that is possible without community and people working together. And so, for me, I think about the barriers, but the barriers are like opportunities in my mind, because I come from an organizing background as well. So, that would be my suggestion there. And I think that the way that we are going to embrace the plurality of society, and meaning that we're going to be a majority of minority groups, is going to have huge implications on our built environment. And that's a very under talked about, but crucially important thing to consider, is that currently those who benefit and build in the context of natural building are soon to be one of a few other majority minority groups. And the question becomes, how does the transformation of society demographically and culturally get reflected within this context of natural building? If it is unable to mirror the way society is going in terms of the shift in cultural and ethnic demographics, natural building is going to have a very secularized trajectory, to put it blunt.
Incredibly well said. And for folks listening to our podcast who are familiar, I can't help but think that people are resonating and also learning new things as you unpack this for us. So thank you for that. And the other thing you brought up was just the need for integrated capital solutions for this. So it's not all coming from, for-profit businesses, but there's kind of accessing capital in different forms. So that was really illuminating for me as well. I'm curious because this ties into another podcast guest we've had on, Doria Robinson, and I believe y'all are actually working with Urban Tilth, or maybe are going to be coming out to California at some point to put a pilot put a building in at their facility, Urban Tilth, in Northern California, in Richmond specifically. But you already kind of alluded to some of these other kind of new frameworks and other nodes. I'm just curious if there's anything else you want to share about collaborations that is inspiring to you right now, or that you'd want to share with our listeners.
Yeah, I think quickly, just sharing the story too of like how, our cooperative is able to be like an economic engine for some of the allies that we have and some other projects that are coming up. We, this past year, just purchased 24 acres of land here in Maryland, and we're able to finance it through the Seed Commons. I know you've had folks from the Seed Commons in the working world on. And, it's really amazing, because our cooperative, we sort of have the ability to finance something like that, but we're sharing that land base with Black Dirt Farm Collective, with the movement ally that we kind of came out of, so that, Earthbound, we're planning to build our kind of dream net zero timber frame shop on the land, but we don't need 24 acres, obviously. So there's all this possibility for affordable housing, for a retreat center, for nature and sort of an outdoor classroom space, for a healing space, for weddings and events to happen, and all of this is coming through sort of the shared collaboration between Earthbound and our movement ally, the Black Dirt Farm Collective, and the various projects that they're running within Black Dirt Farm Collective. Now all of us collectively have this land base so we can work out of, be productive on, call home. So that's just like one example, again, of like the kind of cool and collaborative work that can happen, specifically from the cooperative space and the opportunity that cooperatives have to collaborate kind of more generally.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so inspired to hear that. Rock on. Good work.
Yeah, I know. I mean, just ditto to Dom's point. And, podcasts are funny. I'm totally into this podcast. I'm actually a fan of the podcast. I know Dom is too. But it's like, we're just this voice coming through whatever device the person is listening to. There are all these sort of juxtapositions that the voice coming through a phone, through a radio, through a computer can create. And so I just want to just sort of demystify anything I can and just say that, like, at the end of the day, we're just sort of regular people just trying to be the best people that we can in the context of a rapidly destabilizing planet and a society that, for all intended purposes, shows no concern about that or really about human life. And so that sort of propels our convictions to become better people and thus to be a part of really cool things. And not because we're trying to be cool, but just because that's what's needed. And so, I'm just a simple peasant that can build, and I like to cook, and kids and a partner, and Dom's he does his thing, and Amber's awesome and as a partner and does her thing, and Randy's got a kid and he does his thing, and together we're doing our thing together, and that works for us. But that might not work for somebody else that's listening to this. But that doesn't mean that what we're sharing can't be points of inspiration, because we're very inspired by the things that we do and by each other. And so I just wanted to sort of throw that out there, like, hey, we're just like regular people that are trying to do something righteous and dignified to satisfy our families and also to satisfy our hearts. And then more broadly, at the end of our time, we want to be able to look back on the things that we've done, the people that we've worked with, the relationships that we've formed, and know that we, in our little way, moved the needle. And I think that's the most amount of solace that I can find, that I could share, is that, like, our a human experience as natural builders, timber framers, parents, chefs, and eaters, and whatever else. And so, the listener of this podcast, you're human too, and you're doing righteous and cool things too. And I guess the thing that I would ask is that, and it is an ask, can you do more? I think we're all very educated. We've all gone through an educational process that supports us doing enough. It's like, oh, this will be good enough. Oh, that's okay. And it's like, there's a time and a place for that. But the future, the next 7 generations, both human and biotic, require us to do more. And so my question is, can you do more? I hope that we can. And I hope that those that are listening, we might get the opportunity to do more with you at some point, can learn together. So I just wanted to sort of in that note, and, shout out to, we have a capital campaign for our shop that Dom mentioned on our website. And that's going to be a heavy lift, but we hope to do it with many people and many hands.
Beautifully said. Dom, would you add anything to how listeners can support you and your work and what you need right now?
No, I think that, Blaine summarized really well, like some of the needs we have. I think in general, there's a lot of folks who are working on supporting cooperatives, again, like this sort of movement of people and community taking control of their labor, finding dignity in the work that they do, that push for a just transition that requires resources. So, supporting Earthbound Building for sure, but also like seeking out some of the local cooperators in your region, supporting some of the local loan funds, supporting larger organizations like the Seed Commons or like the Climate Justice Alliance, who are working on providing resources and technical assistance to co-ops. I think right now, as Blaine had mentioned, there's a sense of urgency. And I think that if anything, to provide some of those support or resources to folks like that is going to go a really long way, because there's so much work to be done. And there's such a gap that we're trying to make up that any little bit of support can help. So
thank you both so much for joining us today, for your tireless persistence and work in this sector, and for really reimagining new possibilities for provisioning human shelter and farm infrastructure and really new ways of being and working together. Thank you. I really, really appreciate having you on today.
Yeah, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having us on.
And to your point, Blaine, around the kind of maybe one-way feeling monologue of the podcast, maybe we can do a more interactive gathering with it with some of our MBA students or something like that to keep the conversation rolling.
Yeah. That'd be sweet. Yeah, I mean, I love podcasts. I listen to podcasts too. It's just always like as a listener, I'm just like, oh, this person's not talking to me. They're talking to this other person, but I'm listening in.
Well, it was so great. And I know our listeners are going to be inspired and can't wait to keep the conversation going in many forms. And take care, both you two. Have a great rest of your evenings, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.